JDRF, and I'm the incoming board president of the Central New York chapter. Before we begin, I want to thank all of you again for coming tonight and take a moment to recognize our current chapter board president, John Stepanian. John, would you please stand? Also, could the other board members in the room please stand? We'd like to recognize you. Thank you for all that you do to support our mission. This past July, my son Philip and I attended the Children's Congress in Washington, D.C. It was an amazing experience. It was at Children's Congress where I heard Aaron speak. He was about the advances in type 1 diabetes research. I was extremely impressed and hopeful. I realized at that point how important it would be to have Aaron come to Central New York and share the exciting things that are going on in type 1 diabetes research. It is my pleasure to introduce JDRF's Chief Mission Officer, Dr. Aaron Kowalski. In this role, he leads JDRF's research and advocacy programs. Dr. Kowalski combines his professional experience as a scientist with his personal experience of living with type 1 diabetes for the past 30 years. He is an internationally recognized expert in the area of diabetes technologies and has been a leader of JDRF's Artificial Pancreas Research Project. He has authored numerous articles on type 1 diabetes research and was co-author of the landmark study in the New England Journal of Medicine that revealed the effectiveness of continuous glucose monitors in T1D management. Dr. Kowalski has traveled and spoken globally about diabetes research progress and is known for his ability to translate science into easily understandable concepts and is presented at many national and international scientific conferences. We are so thrilled to have Aaron here tonight.
Excellent. Well, it's really great to be here. It's my honor and pleasure to be here, and thanks, Mike, for all that you do. I know you've been a great champion, and to the board members and everybody coming out. So my name is Aaron Kowalski. I'm JDRF Chief Mission Officer, and some people say, what does Chief Mission Officer really mean? It sounds like Star Trek, the mission. But I am a scientist. I have been at JDRF for 14 years. I work at JDRF. Our team is based in New York City and in Washington. And the mission is curing diabetes and helping people until we get there. So to do that, we fund research. So I oversee a team of research scientists at JDRF who will help distribute the money that we fund across the world. And then we have our advocacy program focused on federal funding, and I'll talk about this, regulatory policy, health policy, because ultimately, all of these things need to be in place for people to do better. And that's the mission. It's not just research. Research is a means, but it's not the end. So I have the responsibility of overseeing that. I have ties to the area a little bit. My brother and his wife and family live a little bit west of here in Skaneateles and are both Syracuse grads, rabid Syracuse fans. One of my most important team members, head of our Washington office, she was just texting me, we have some meetings with Dr. Weinstock tomorrow, that her parents live 2 miles from there, and her father, Cynthia Rice, her father is a longtime Syracuse professor in the engineering department. So it's really great to be here. So I'm going to talk about what is JDRF doing, how do we think about research, what is the progress that's happening, and then hopefully folks will have some questions. I always think when I come and I meet different families that, sometimes people think, can I really make a difference? And I've been fortunate to have spent time with both of the founding moms of JDRF, Lee Ducat from Philadelphia and Carol Lurie from New York. And it's amazing that it's coming up on 40 years now that they were two moms who just wanted something better for their kids. I think everybody in this room can appreciate that. And they catalyzed kind of a revolution in type 1 diabetes, which is amazing. And then my connection, so I work at JDRF, but I used to show these two pictures up in the corner here. This is my brother, Steve. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. He's the next oldest. He was diagnosed with type 1 when he was 3. And then here I am. And some of you have heard me tell this joke, but I always say, if looking like that wasn't hard enough, when I was 13, add diabetes on top of it. But to me now, it's really way more than just my family. Of course, I care about my family a lot. They're most important to me. But there's so much. This to me is all about JDRF. I asked via social media for people to send me their T1D connections, and people sent all these amazing pictures. This guy played Division I and pro football with type 1. This mom from Chicago, her family was worried about her getting pregnant. She went on CGM and had a healthy baby. And I imagine all of these pictures will resonate in one way or another with you all, people doing rides. We have hockey fans up here, and actors, lacrosse players, football players. Now, type 1 is hard, and some of us were talking about this is the community. We don't want any more members of this club, but it is an amazing group of people all aligned to try to cure this disease. So I show this because this is what motivates me on a daily basis. Now, the one thing that I like to talk about when I talk about the role of JDRF and what are we doing is progress. Everybody wants progress, and sometimes when you're living with type 1, it's hard to step back and say, are we really making any progress? So this is kind of just a little history tour. This was the way that we used to test when my brother was diagnosed. So there was no blood sugar testing back then, 1977. It was just urine testing, and you would pee on a tape, they called it test tape, and it turned color if you had sugar in the urine. So you can imagine that this actually doesn't start happening until about 250 for most people. And it was essentially just not high or high. And it was however many hours ago, depending on when you went to the bathroom. So you can imagine it was very crude how we used to dose insulin, about once or twice a day back then. This is my first Lancet device. And my brother, who lives in Skaneateles, is an industrial designer. And we always say, this goes in the annals of bad industrial design. If you talk to did anybody else in the room use this one? Most old timers will say that this was called the guillotine. These were the test strips that I was diagnosed on. So back then, when they first started doing blood glucose monitors, some of you have probably seen the pictures of the big clunky ones, but most people use these test strips that were color-based. And we often talk about the accuracy of CGM devices. Well, look at the numbers here. You were 20, 40, 80, 120, 180, 2-minute reading, 3-minute reading if you were higher, 240 or 400. And I often joke that my brother and I often saw a much lighter color than my parents. We'd always be like, yeah, 120. Lots of 120s on the fridge. Oh, man. This is a good one. So this pump was made in the 60s. They were thinking about, hey, could we make an artificial pancreas? So Mike mentioned I led the JDRF Artificial Pancreas Project. And this was like one of the first prototypes. And I'll get into how we're often thinking at JDRF, which is a lot of people fixate on A1C. But everybody here knows that diabetes is more than A1C. So there's this balance, and I'll show a teeter-totter that often says there's glucose and then there's life. So you can imagine not the easiest thing to live with diabetes, confronted with the alternative of doing shots. And surprisingly or not surprisingly, this wasn't commercialized. This was commercialized, this pump. This was, many people called the blue brick. The real name was called the auto syringe. And if you don't know the story behind this, it's really interesting. And the people who were involved are still involved. The person who made this is a guy named Dean Kamen. I don't know if the high school students here know Dean Kamen. My son who's a high school senior, did robotics all the way through high school. And there was called First Robotics, was created by Dean Kamen. He runs a company almost due east of here in Manchester, New Hampshire, called DECA, that does all sorts of really high-end engineering. He actually built the prototype of this when he was in high school, and his brother was a pediatric oncologist at Yale. And his brother wanted to dose chemotherapy in kids that was prolonged instead of in big boluses. And Dean was really handy, and he said, could you build a syringe that dosed over 24 hours? And he did it. He built it in his garage as a high school student. 2 doctors at Yale saw that, and they said, we should try this for diabetes. It would be better than doing injections. And then Baxter came along and commercialized it. But you can see this was pretty big. There are pictures of kids playing basketball and soccer with this. They actually quasi-miniaturized it. If you go to the DECA headquarters in New Hampshire, they have the various versions. One of the funniest things, I didn't even know this, that Baxter, when they started manufacturing more of them, they changed it into it looked like a big calculator. And then the brand name was the Ugly. Hey, check out my Ugly. And that stood for euglycemia, but I was like, annals of bad marketing. And then this is the first artificial pancreas, and this one always cracks me up. Again, getting to the balancing act, this was used in real life in hospitals. But, and it mmade your blood sugar perfect. But if you look at the person, I don't know if that's any way to live. She's catatonic. So, we've made progress if you think of the tools we have now. But the other thing is, diabetes is more than just A1C. So I always think of when we're thinking of a balancing act, you want the best diabetes health. So that could be A1C, that could be fewer lows, that could be better sleep. Whoop, I think I just pulled it off. Let's see. Sorry. It could be less variability. But often one of the challenges, if you saw the evolution of these tools, is sometimes you're making a trade-off for better health with more work. And the perfect example of that is finger sticking. Anybody could do 30 finger sticks a day and get better diabetes health, but it's really not a great way to live. Wearing a pump, CGM, see your blood sugars, but it alarms a lot. So the ultimate goal for us at JDRF is a cure. A cure would fix the equation. It would rebalance it, and you would go back to your normal life issues, problems, or challenges and successes. But in the meantime, we need to come up with solutions that maximize health, minimize burden, maximize happiness. And I think you'll see the strategies that we're using. We're making headway on that. Now, just the last little bit on this intro is, if you think of where we've come from and where we are, one of the kind of myths out there is that, gosh, if you just tried a lot harder, you would have a perfect A1C. And the question is that true? Could you try your way down to an A1C of 5.5? And there may be somebody in here with a 5.5 A1C, but the bulk of people can't do that. And the bulk of people who have 5.5 A1Cs have beta cell function, with all due respect to anybody who has a 5.5 A1C in here. So what the data says, and I'm a big data person, is it's really hard. In the US, about 1 in 5 kids make A1C goal. So if you have a kid who isn't at A1C goal below 7.5, you're not alone. It's really, really hard. About 1 in 3 adults make A1C goal. So this is a big registry across the United States of people with type 1. Represented differently, you can see in the teenage years, the average A1C for a 17-year-old in the US right now is 9.3%. And that's because hormones, puberty, and life. Everybody here, so there are some teenagers here. You know, you got college, you've got tests, you've got boyfriends and girlfriends, you've got all this stuff, and diabetes can fall down, and then you have hormones and puberty and all that stuff. You see at about 30, people settle down and do a better, but this is the goal, is below this line. So it's really, what we see is it's really hard. DKA is still a big problem. Severe hypoglycemia is a big barrier to doing better. If there was no such thing as hypoglycemia, we would just give more insulin and none of us would be here right now. Because you could just dose insulin more and you would have a good A1C and everybody would just take however much insulin they needed. The problem is you can have a seizure and have serious problems if you give too much insulin. And this just shows you that it's still common in the type 1 population, and the longer you live with type 1, the more common it becomes. And one of the things that we do is that we do a lot of advocacy, and one of our big successes this year was Medicare coverage for CGM. Look at the people who would benefit the most from CGM, and Medicare wasn't covering it. It was unbelievable. So if you think of the mission and thinking about research, CGM research is for the most part done. But these people were having access issues. So we hadn't achieved the mission. Now we advocated, and CMS is covering CGM. So this is a big barrier. Just 2 more slides, because I think there are some important points here. This is a technical slide, but I'll walk you through it because I show this in every talk I give, just to highlight how difficult diabetes management is, even with today's best tools. So this was a study that we funded that took place at Stanford and the Barbara Davis Center in Colorado, 2 of the best centers in the world. And what they were doing is they were testing a predictive low glucose suspend pump. So this was a pump that just turned the insulin down or off if the blood sugar was predicted to go low. And the way the experiment was set up was it was only running overnight, and the people who were in the study, when they would go to bed, they would just turn on a laptop. They were wearing a pump and a sensor, and they just turned the system on. And the system had the algorithm that would control the pump, but they didn't know if it was actually working on any given night. So you can see that we call that a controlled experiment. Some nights it was active, and other nights it wasn't. And the people didn't know. And that way, you're really testing, is it the system that's doing the benefit, or is it the person? If the person knew it was going to be on, they may change their behavior. So in any case, the punchline is the automation reduced lows a lot. That's great. But the thing that I find amazing, and we've used this data with FDA and insurance companies, is the control nights. So these are people wearing an insulin pump, wearing a CGM, testing 8 times a day at 2 of the best centers in the world, and in a clinical trial. When you're in a clinical trial, you do better because you know people are watching you. 8% of the nights, these kids spent over a 2-hour period low. For the little ones, 5% of the night. So once every 3 weeks, these 4-year-olds were spending over 2 hours low while in bed. So think about that. When somebody says, you just need to try harder, that's not it. We need better tools. And that's what JDRF is about, is trying to, we've made progress. These solutions are great that are helping us, but this to me says we haven't come far enough. This is the last data slide I'm going to show you, because this is crazy. So one of the things that I find interesting, and everybody here will empathize with this, is the variability of when you wake up in the morning and what your blood sugar is. You try to do everything exactly the same. One morning you wake up, you're 120, you're like, yes, amazing. Next morning it's 300, the next morning it's 50. How is this? How is it possible? So one of the things that we've learned in the artificial pancreas research, and this is a slide from Cambridge in England, is you can go back in these experiments and actually see, is the basal rate right or not in your pump? how much insulin does it really take to get to the target? So most of these experiments, the target's between 100 and 120. So how, these artificial pancreas systems are really good at driving the glucose to that number. So you can actually go back and retroanalyze the data and say, how many units did it take me to get to 100? And that's what this slide shows you. And you don't, I'll explain it to you. But the bottom line is, in this Cambridge study, when they retroanalyzed the data, their target was between 110, around, say it's 110. That the variability night to night was about 300% on the basal rates. So one night, to get to 110, the kids would need 1 unit an hour. The next night, they would need 3 units an hour. The next night, they may need 0.3 units an hour. It's hugely variable. Look at this, up and down. So when you think about all the work that you do, try to set the basal rates right, I don't want to say it's voodoo science. You're getting it to the best you can, but the body's requirements vary tremendously day in and day out, depending on what you're doing, what you're eating, the site, everything, life. And again, this is the punchline here is, I'm going to get to the research, is it's a really almost impossible problem that we're trying to solve right now in open loop therapy. So we need better solutions. So JDRF is really trying to fix this problem. I'm really proud of the work we're doing. Since the founding moms started the organization, over $2 billion in research. When I started at JDRF about 13 years ago, we funded about 3 clinical trials. We have over 70 now across our portfolio. Funding in 21 countries. I was in Israel last week, amazing research going on there. A few weeks before that, I was in Italy. I was on the phone with our JDRF Australia CEO yesterday. Federal funding, I mentioned our advocacy program, over $2.5 billion from NIH via Congress for type 1 from our advocacy program. The other thing, when you donate to JDRF, last year we funded $86 million across the world. But the other thing that our teams do is we're constantly looking to leverage the money that you give, or you raise, or your friends give. We got $12 million in partnered funding through other foundations. So for example, one of our most important partners in type 1 diabetes is the Helmsley Charitable Trust. Everybody remembers Leona Helmsley, the Queen of Mean. She has a grandson. She's passed away, obviously, now, but her grandson has 2 daughters with type 1. They're funding the Helmsley Trust via the one trustee about $50 to $60 million a year. And they have funded us, JDRF, almost $100 million over the last 8 years. So we partner with them a lot on funding. We partner with industry. Government, so US government, we have a big partnership in Canada. Canadian government over the last 5 years has put in about $40 million to type 1 diabetes research in partnership with JDRF. The Australian government's done about $50 million US dollars. The EU has recently done about 60 million euros, and JDRF has worked with them on that. So there's a huge leverage, and I think it's important to realize that there are only 2 organizations who work like this, JDRF and Helmsley in T1D. Helmsley's in a unique position that they don't raise money, they just give it away. They sit on a $5.5 billion trust. But if you're giving us money, we're working really, really hard to leverage that so it goes a lot further. And this is just kind of the philosophy. I mentioned the mission. The mission is not just research. Research is foundational, because if we don't do research, we're not going to make any progress. But really, the measure of our ultimate success is better outcomes. The goal is to cure type 1. Unfortunately, a cure is not going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen as soon as humanly possible for us. Prevention, I'll talk about prevention and better treatments. So I'm just going to go into some of the updates because there's amazing progress happening here. Whoops. So artificial pancreas is a program that I've overseen for a long time. And it's amazing the progress that we've made. So today I played golf. This is a beautiful place to play golf. And one of our golfing partners had the 670G pump on. Katie, who works on my team, has been part of these artificial pancreas trials for over 10 years and has actually been on the Medtronic 670G for over 2 years now because she was part of the FDA pivotal trial. This approval for Medtronic of the first hybrid closed loop, the Medtronic president will say happened between probably about 5 years earlier than they expected because of JDRF's research and advocacy. And you would say, oh, you know, how do you come up with that number? The Medtronic 530G lagged Europe by 4 years approval. The Medtronic 670G has been approved in the US for about 18 months now. It's not approved anywhere else in the world yet. So this pump has been transformative. And I'll get into some of the data, better A1Cs, less lows. Overnight control essentially normalized. Absolutely amazing. And now we have a number of other companies. JDRF is a big believer that competition is really important, that people with diabetes need more options, and that competition drives innovation and progress. So Insulet has a great program going on. Tandem, a new company called Bigfoot, Roche. I'm going to talk a little bit about our open source program. And the other thing that JDRF is working on is just the next generation of these systems. So could you make everything smaller? Can you make it fully automatic? If you've seen, the Dexcom just got approval for their G6 sensor, no finger sticking, which is awesome. It's going to launch to the market next month for the bulk of the population. That's great. Auto inserter, that's better. Smaller transmitter, that's better. Dexcom is partnering with Google to make an M&M size disposable sensor. That would be better. So we have been working with all of these companies to try to optimize and simplify. I'm going to talk about open source. So I've been on an open source closed loop. I can, now you think about what could make something better or easier. I can look at my pump data and my sensor data. It's always a little bit risky to pull this out and see what the number is. But I'm 174 right now. And I can now, so I'll say, all right, I need to correct a little bit. And I'll just correct like this. Thumbprint. So I'm thumbprint bolusing. My brother boluses off his iWatch. You know, I think about, the innovations when you think of life and glucose. I was talking to somebody last night actually, not pulling out the pump at school, being able to bolus. That's a big deal. And, I'm benefiting from that now. So this gets into this idea of open protocol, so I'm going to just talk about what this means. If you don't know this, there is a community of engineers, mathematicians, really smart people who have reverse engineered their own closed loop systems. So I mentioned Bigfoot is a new company. It all started with a guy there. He's a very close friend of mine. He hacked together a closed loop for his wife and son. And once people saw that he did it, a bunch of other people tried to figure it out. And now there are 3 open source closed loops out there. There's potential risks. They're not FDA regulated. It's fully kind of out, a bunch of people doing it. But I've been using one of these for 1.5 years, as has my brother. And it's transformative. So, I talk about the Medtronic 670G. Mine is a Medtronic pump, a Dexcom sensor, and an app. And then a little radio. You can see this little radio. It's called a Riley Link. It communicates between the Medtronic pump and the iPhone. My blood sugar, 99% of the time in the morning, is between 110 and 130. Flat, every night. I'm going to talk about that balancing act. The number one thing you'll hear from people on closed loop systems is they sleep better. Your blood sugar is normal overnight. The daytime is smoother. It's not normalized, but depending on if you eat carbs or not, I eat carbs. So if I eat carbs, you're going to go up. You still need to bolus. But the thing about this is the innovation is happening like crazy. But it's been happening under the table. The pump that I use, some of you probably will recognize it. It's an old Medtronic 750 series. People are buying these on a black market right now. So what we've been trying to do is figure out, how do you bring this innovation above the table? The companies want this above the table. FDA wants it above the table. We don't want people buying pumps on Craigslist and eBay. So we've been working, JDRF, this was a bold move for us, to have the ability to do it yourself with legitimate pumps. Just had a big meeting at FDA with all of the companies. And the idea is you could use the traditional, like a 670, that would be great. But if you want to go into open source mode, that you could use a traditional pump. So JDRF is pushing on this. It's been pretty amazing. All right, some other areas that are, one of the things that I often say, when I talk about technology, people get a little worried because they say, I didn't sign up for technology, my kid won't wear technology, or I don't like a pump, I do shots. And I totally get that. I talk about the technology with a lot of enthusiasm because it's happening. It's real. I'm benefiting from it. A lot of people are benefiting from it. That said, the joke that I often make, and I talk to the companies about this too, is, I'll just ask the question, how many people don't have diabetes in the room? All right. How many of you who don't have diabetes are wearing an insulin pump right now? Nobody. Still searching. I joke that when you see tubing on somebody out in the public, I always say it's like spotting a unicorn. You're like, oh my God, look, the person has diabetes over there. But it's never been the case that you tap them on the shoulder and say, oh, you have type 1? And they're like, no, just couldn't pass up the opportunity to wear an insulin pump. It's just too much, poke myself every 3 days, rip it out on doorknobs, carry it around on my bathing suit. So trust me, I get it. The goal, pumps and technologies are something that are going to tide us over until we get to better solutions. But nobody does it for fun. And I say that to people like all of us in the room who live with diabetes, but I also say that a lot to the companies. Because sometimes, again, the companies come up with solutions, and they're like, hey, but it improves your blood sugar. Yeah, but I was going to say it sucks. Sorry. It needs to be better. So we're also working on a lot of solutions that I think will also hopefully obsolete devices as soon as possible. One potential solution is glucose-responsive insulin. We have a huge program here. I didn't show the insulins that we grew up on, my brother and me, but it used to be cow and pig insulin. Then it went to human recombinant insulin. Now we have insulin analogs. They're all improvements through genetic engineering. The holy grail is, could you make an insulin that's inactive in your bloodstream if the glucose is low, but if glucose builds up in your bloodstream, it activates the insulin in an as-needed way. So we funded work at MIT where these really smart young guys created a glucose-responsive insulin. They called it a smart insulin. They could give diabetic rats a shot of this, and for 3 to 4 days at a time, their blood sugar would be totally normalized. And these are rats that needed insulin or they would die. Their blood sugars looked like people with diabetes up and down all over the place. Flat. They could run on wheels like crazy. Flat. They could eat a lot. Flat. Eat a little. Flat. It was truly glucose responsive. Merck came along and acquired this company and poured a lot of money into it. And unfortunately, the first candidate that they had has not worked out. They're still pushing forward with other candidates, and we have Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, Sanofi, and a number of small companies working on this. The idea would be you would take one shot a day, and that would be it. Not a cure, But if you could wake up in the morning and just give a shot, not get high or low, that would be pretty amazing. So huge amount of work going on glucose-responsive insulin. Another area that we're working on is what we call adjunctive therapies. So a big thing that hit the news this week is this company that we funded, Lexicon. They've created a drug that causes you to pee out extra sugar. So remember I showed you the test tape. When your kidneys get too much sugar in your blood, it spills into your urine. What these guys have figured out is you can lower that number and have people pee out the high blood sugar that they have. So you've probably seen this in type 2 diabetes. There are a number of drugs approved for type 2 people. Forxiga, I'm blanking on the names, the brand names. In any case, Onglyza. If you watch golf, you'll see a lot of these commercials. They've been hugely successful in type 2. They help people have better A1Cs, they lose weight, they seem to have heart and kidney benefits. This company has come along, and it's a once-a-day pill, and is going for a type 1 approval, which is really cool. And again, you can take a pill, and I have a number of friends who are using the type 2 versions, and your blood sugar is really normalized. Now, there have been, in the type 2 people, some risks. One of the risks that we've seen in type 1 people is what's called euglycemic DKA, which is a weird phenomenon. But essentially what's happening is we've seen some people, their blood sugars are so good, they start ramping down their insulin. And they ramp it down, they're losing weight, they're super happy. Oh my God, my A1C is really great. It goes from like 9 down to 6 and 7, and lose 5, 10 pounds. And then one of my friends, his son was doing this. All of a sudden, over a weekend, he ends up in DKA. And what he did is he stopped taking his insulin. And his blood sugars were normal. And the reason, most people associate high blood sugar with DKA. But remember, high blood sugar doesn't cause DKA. Low insulin causes DKA. Because your body needs insulin to process the sugar. And if it can't process the sugar, it processes proteins and fats, and that causes ketones. So it's not the high blood sugar. The high blood sugar is a byproduct of this process. So what happens is you're peeing out that high sugar. So you don't see the high sugar. And people who don't appreciate that you're still type 1 and you still need to take insulin have gotten into trouble. So what we hope will happen is that there'll just be strict warnings. If you have type 1 diabetes, you still need to take insulin. But these could be very, very helpful drugs, particularly for people who have high A1Cs. So this is an area that I'm really excited about, beta cell replacement. This is the idea of, could you cure type 1 without fixing autoimmunity? And the way we would do this is encapsulating cells. And we have a number of projects that are going on. I'll give you an anecdote of how amazing, the promise of cell therapy is pretty incredible. For a long time, we've known that cell therapy can work through islet transplantation. And JDRF and everybody has backed off of islet transplantation because it has two big problems. There's not enough cells to go around because you're harvesting the cells from organs of people who passed away, and chronic immunosuppression for the rest of your life. But I was just with one of the most famous diabetes researchers in the world. His name is James Shapiro. He was the person who came up with what's called the Edmonton Protocol that revolutionized islet transplantation. And I was with him in Canada a couple weeks ago, and he talked about the Edmonton Protocol that happened 18 years ago, and that he still has a number of patients with one infusion of cells who are still completely off insulin 18 years later, which is pretty amazing. So they're essentially cured of their type 1 for 18 years with a treatment of cells. The problem is, again, they're on immunosuppressants, which increases your risk of cancers and just regular everyday illnesses. And they've only been able to do about 500 lifetime islet transplants because of the lack of cell source. Now we can make cells in quantity. And there are a number of companies doing human clinical trials. This is ViaCyte. They just reported out that in their human clinical trials, they're seeing cells grow up and make insulin. We have DRI, the biohub at the University of Miami. Beta O2 is an Israeli company. There's a new company called SEMA, Cerenova. A number of companies moving into this space. You know, some people worry about embryonic stem cell research. My family's Catholic. That's a big worry. Much of this research, and it's interesting, I just came back from a stem cell conference at the Vatican, at which the Pope spoke about the promise of stem cell research, really talking more about pluripotent cells from skin or other places. You know, amazing science going on here. I'm going to just digress to another incredible story that I just learned of in coming out of Canada as well. So picture, to replace these cells and cure people, we're looking at a couple of different ways to do it. One we call macroencapsulation. This is putting like a Band-Aid under your skin that's stuffed with cells, and the material protects it from the immune system. Another is called microencapsulation, where you coat the individual islets and you can inject them right into your body. Another way to do this is actually with no protection to the cells. You'd say, well, how's that possible? Your body will reject them. Well, there are a number of people, there was actually just a story on 60 Minutes about this, using what's called CRISPR technology, where you can go in and edit genes in cells. And they're going to attempt to make these cells not susceptible to autoimmune attack. But the amazing story coming out of Canada is there are some people who have a different form of diabetes called monogenic diabetes. They're essentially born with diabetes because of a mutation, not because of autoimmunity. So I have some friends, they have 4 type 1s in the family, they have monogenic diabetes. Their insulin has a mutation and it doesn't work. There are other people who have mutations where the insulin can't get out of their beta cells. So I was just with this researcher in Canada, and he is gearing up to do a human clinical trial where they're going to take stem cells from these people, taken from their skin, turn them into beta cells, which they can do, CRISPR treat them to fix the mutation in the cell, and then treat them and replace the cells. And it could cure their monogenic diabetes. So this technology is going crazy right now. It's really, really amazing science, and I'm proud of JDRF has really led the way on this. So I'll just show you ViaCyte, human clinical trials. SEMA is a company out of Harvard led by Doug Melton. SEMA stands for Sam and Emma. He has 2 kids with type 1. This is an amazing story. Lilly just invested in a company that's spun out of MIT called Sigilon. So MIT, everybody knows MIT is an amazing institution. One of the world's most famous engineers is based there. His name is Bob Langer. You can look him up. He's legendary. And this whole partnership is a fortuitous JDRF connection where a scientist on my team, her son was accepted to MIT. She knew Bob Langer was there. She knew he was doing stuff that could be applied, she thought, to diabetes. And she literally emailed him and said, my son's going there. I'm here for Parents' Weekend, and I want to meet you and talk about diabetes and getting you to focus on diabetes. She made a pitch to him. He said, yeah, we could do this. Now picture that his lab, I think, has over 100 postdocs in it and gets something like 1,000 postdoc applications every year for like 6 or 7 slots. It's one of the most amazing places you'll ever see. And we had them working on microencapsulation. They spun up a company called Sigilon. Lilly just announced 2 weeks ago a partnership with Sigilon. Microencapsulated islets. I mean, this is really happening. This week, Novo announced that they're working with UCSF and Cornell on microencapsulation and potentially macroencapsulation. So one of the scientists at one of the big companies told me that he told the CEO, cell therapy is not a matter of if anymore, it's only a matter of when. So we are making a major push on this. The goal would be an implantation or an injection that would restore normal blood sugars for at least 2 years at a time. Really incredible science happening here, and I'm excited about it. Now, this is a cool partnership. I know this area has some Lockheed Martin connections. So when you think about how do you package cells and keep them happy, that's where a lot of the magic. When I was in Israel, I was meeting with some companies that are doing some crazy material science. Bob Langer, one of the world's best. Well, think of Lockheed Martin. Everybody thinks of them as a defense contractor, but they have these huge businesses in technology. And we actually now have a partnership on graphene, so these are carbon-based nanomembranes, and we were talking about this in the prequel here. They can make very thin membranes and drill holes to whatever size they want. So this little JDRF logo is actually under a microscope, and those holes were drilled through their technology. And the idea, they're working with UMass, is they have a technology that may coat the cells and protect them. Immune system can't get at the islets. They can be happy because really a lot of the challenge for us is we want these membranes to be as thin as possible because islets require a lot of oxygen and nutrients. So just really awesome stuff happening here. All right, I'm going to quickly go through the last little bit is, could you cure people from within? And the last little bit is, we now know from a number of studies coming out of Joslin Clinic and some other places that even people who've had diabetes a long time, so my brother's up to 41 years, I'm at 34 years, it turns out that our pancreases are probably always trying to get going again, but the immune system is always fighting it back. We know that even people with 50 years of diabetes are still trying to make insulin. I want to see this slide. I can't remember what slide I have next. So there are a variety of ways that we're trying to say, could you stimulate those cells to get going again? The way that I think in simple terms, and some of you may have heard me use this analogy, but for those of you who don't, the way that I think of this is I call it the whack-a-mole analogy for type 1 diabetes. Everybody knows I hope everybody knows whack-a-mole. You hit the moles, you get some tickets out of the machine, and you know, for parents, you spend like $20 on a plastic spider ring. But the analogy is, for a long time, we have been trying to figure out, there's a kid at the whack-a-mole machine who's like the world's best player. In fact, he's breaking the machine. The moles never get up. And for a long time, we've been trying to figure out, why is this kid so crazy, and how do we stop him? This is the immune system beating back the beta cells. But the interesting story that's happening, I'm going to actually go past, I can come back to this, is a little slide, is we think of the immune system as two components in simple terms. One that's fighting stuff that's bad. We call that the effector. This EFF stands for effector side. You know, you kill viruses and bacteria, and your immune system's really good at that. It kills stuff from within your body. If you are out on the golf course in the sun for too long, you'll get mutations in your DNA. And if those cells start getting off track, your immune system will kill them. There's a regulatory side that keeps this whole thing under control. And who's good and who's bad? What's foreign and what's self? So think of the whack-a-mole analogy. Forever, we've been trying to figure out, why are there some cells over here that are killing beta cells? That shouldn't happen. And we've got to find them, because if we do, we'll cure type 1 diabetes. But the big push that's really amazing in this field right now is, if there was a kid whacking away at the whack-a-mole machine, what should normally happen? Normally the parent should come over and fix it, right? And that's where a lot of the action is happening. The parents normally would say, hey, you know, Bobby, you should probably take a break and play something else. We see massive amount happening now on the immune regulation side. You can't read the news now without hearing about immune regulation, CAR T cells, immunotherapies for cancer biology. One of the leading scientists in type 1 diabetes immunology just was appointed about a year and a half ago, the lead of a large anti-cancer initiative focused on cancer immunotherapy. He's never worked in cancer before. He's been focused on immune regulation. Healthy state is a balanced state. And his work is focused on balancing back the equation. And the beauty of that is this will be applicable not only to type 1 diabetes, but broad autoimmunity. So you would say, well, why would he be involved in cancer if he's a type 1 person working on balance? Because cancer is essentially the mirror image of autoimmunity. In autoimmunity, the kid's beating on the machine. In cancer, the kid's not playing. In both cases, normally the parents are guiding the child. In immunity, normally they're guiding. One of the side effects of some of the most successful cancer drugs right now have actually been autoimmune problems. Some of the very successful cancer immunotherapies are causing type 1 in some people, which shows you actually they've solved part of the balance issue in fighting that cancer, but they've tipped it a little too far. The reason I'm excited about this is huge amounts of money going into this and drug development that's happening very quickly. So it's really quite interesting. The last piece that I'll talk about is prevention. And I often call this my Mythbusters part of my talk because a lot of people wonder about the risks of diabetes. Is type 1 diabetes genetic? And everybody has a different answer. Even if I talk to doctors, it's not genetic. Lots of people say it's not genetic. Lots will say it skips a generation. It only happens in females in the second generation, and then you name it. It's all sorts of crazy stuff. Type 1 diabetes has a strong genetic component. I can show this. The average person in this area, in fact, in the United States, has a 4 in 1,000 chance of getting type 1. My kids have a 5 in 100 chance of getting type 1. If you're a female with type 1, your kids have a 3 in 100 chance. If you have 2 siblings, it's actually probably up to 20 in 100. Identical twins, it's between 30 and 50 in 100 will get type 1. So what we know is there's genetics and then there's the environment. Something has to catalyze you over the hump, but if you care about type 1 diabetes, we need to also care about prevention because it's permeating the genes of the other family members we have, including the parents. 50% of type 1 diagnoses in Europe are above age 30 right now. So we have a major push on prevention. There are a number of different things that we're doing from screening. Dr. Weinstock is a major TrialNet person. Interventional clinical trials. Our CEO has one son with type 1 and one with multiple autoantibodies. He's been in a prevention trial. So screening is a big part of the component, identifying people who are at risk. Another thing is what causes type 1. We have a huge partnership with IBM Watson to identify what is that trigger. Why is it that some people progress and some people don't? Or why do people progress faster or slower? This has been amazing. I was telling the folks that I was at IBM's research facilities in Yorktown Heights, down by above the Tappan Zee. And they have 1,700 PhD scientists working at this facility. And JDRF is tapping some of that knowledge to try to unwind this. You know, one of the things we've learned is many people will say, I know exactly what caused my kids type 1. They had the flu right before they got it, and that caused it. It's not true. It's not what caused your child's type 1 or your type 1. We now know that the bulk of antibody formation happens between age 3 and 5. I was diagnosed at 13. I don't have any story like that, but I probably had antibodies for upwards of 8 or 9 years before I got the disease. And we now have samples where we can test and not say, hey, you got sick here, what was wrong, but when the immune system actually went haywire. And that's what IBM is working on. We also have a partnership with Google that we're going to begin working on things like this. So I talked about these clinical trials. I'm gonna skip that. Advocacy. If you're not an advocate, I'm just going to beg you. Everybody in this room should be a diabetes advocate. Much of the progress we've made is JDRF funding, but it's federal funding. $150 million a year. If you're in Congressman Reed's district, which I think is relatively close near to here, huge type 1 supporter and has been critical in our fight for type 1 federal funding. But also these other policy issues where we have worked with the FDA and payers to secure coverage. This is all advocacy. And we don't benefit unless you get stuff in your hands. So it's easy. Just go to our website, click on Become an Advocate. You'll get notifications every once in a while to ping your congressperson. So I urge you to do that. Now the last piece, I know I'm going a little long here, is exercise. Now the one thing that one of my top doctor friends always says is the number one most underprescribed treatment for diabetes is exercise. And part of that, that's easy to say, but everybody knows here that exercising with type 1 can be hard because of the variability in blood sugar and the fear of hypoglycemia. We brought together the world's top people to create a program called JDRF Peak that put together how, kind of the fundamentals of how to exercise most successfully. And it's all types of exercise, from endurance, aerobic exercise like running for long distances, to mixed exercise like ice hockey, to exercise like weightlifting, CrossFit, sprinting. How do you do it? How do you avoid overnight lows? How do you fuel during races or competitions? How do you deal with stress-driven highs? We're going to be rolling this out at all of our summits. We're going to have an online tool. You know, my parents grew up with us always exercising and playing sports. I like to run a lot. And it has helped me tremendously in terms of providing fundamentals. So if anybody has questions about exercise, we can talk about that. And I'll stop with my last slide. I always do show these. You know, the best thing that my parents did for me growing up and my brother was say that you will do anything your friends do and more. We're not going to let you have type 1 hold you back. And that's, you know, they said it will be harder. You're going to have this additional burden. But, you know, you see me here. Hopefully you recognize that's a Verrazano Bridge. I've done 20 marathons with type 1. You can see I have a little fanny pack. You know you have a, you know, you're a nerdy type 1 when you're like, hey, check out this really cool fanny pack I got. But my brothers and I played varsity sports. Just this weekend, I came back from Israel on Friday. I landed at 5, and I ran the Brooklyn Half Marathon this weekend, and I ran a pretty good race. So I always tweet out diabetes no limits or T1D no limits. I think it's a really important message to walk away with. So we have a great team. You can email me if you think of questions or if you have issues or you want to talk about anything. I tweet a lot. I'm on social media. Again, it's really great to be up here. I know this community does a ton for JDRF, and I hope you leave realizing that we are making progress. It's an exciting time. We're not there yet. We're going to continue to need your help, but we're getting there. So happy to answer any questions. Thanks. Usually just takes one. Everybody looks around like, who's going to ask the first question?
I've heard a lot of stories. It's really difficult to get the new pumps from Medtronic. You're on wait list forever. You don't get all the supplies. And it's one more stress to someone with type 1 that wants to get that pump and they just can't get it.
So the question is the lack of availability of the 670G. So this has been where JDRF played a role that I think Medtronic really weren't ready for how fast that went through FDA. And then the demand was huge, and the hurricane hit Puerto Rico, and a lot of Medtronic's manufacturing is in Puerto Rico. So it was a huge setback on the sensor piece. I want to say 50 to 75% of their sensors are manufactured there. So it has been very frustrating. I empathize with that. I know it's improved, but they're still not there. And this is a perfect example of why competition is important. You know, having only one solution out there is inadequate. I'm on this hybrid closed loop, and I have to do it myself. We want multiple. Each of those other companies is targeting the 2019 to 2020 timeframe. I would expect by 2020, you'll have at least 4 to 5 closed loop systems on the market. Another avenue that we're pursuing is interoperable closed loops. So I think what you're going to see is a lot of miniaturization of pumps and a lot of movement to app-based control. And if you had that, you could see a lot more pump companies coming and selling cheaper pumps. So we continue to work with Medtronic and trying to get that out there more. Trust me, Medtronic would die to have more pumps. I mean, because they have a big advantage with nobody else on the market right now. As a business, it's a huge hit and miss for them. But they did have some crazy circumstances. One being the hurricane that just devastated Puerto Rico terribly. And then, you know, the business planning may not have been the best, but they got approval much sooner than they expected. Other questions?
Has there been any progress creating a stable injectable form of glucagon so you can have a true product group?
Yeah. Well, so just be forewarned that I'm a glucagon skeptic, even though JDRF funds a significant amount of work here. So I'll get in. So yes, there's progress. There are a number of companies working on it. Novo is, Lilly is. There's a really excellent company in Denmark called Zealand. They're working on it. There's a company in Texas called Xeris. So yes, there will be liquid glucagons, I expect, in the next few years. There are some big questions, though, so I'll explain my reticence. One is, having been on this system for a year and a half, hypoglycemia is a minimal concern of mine. My brother has been in the hospital well over 100 times for severe hypoglycemia. He's been on this system, and he almost never gets low. And the reason is, you have to really kind of mess up a lot to make yourself low. Because even if when you're coming down, it's removing, it's turning off insulin. That said, you definitely can still get low. The challenge is, it will not make it a fully closed loop. Because glucagon doesn't help with the real problem that I've experienced with this. You're still dosing insulin subcutaneously. When you dose insulin through your skin, you cannot deal with carbs. Everybody who doesn't have diabetes here, as soon as you went up to the buffet or to get a soda, your pancreas is already making insulin before you even touch the food. And it serves a very important physiologic purpose. It talks to your pancreas, it talks to your liver, and then it talks to the rest of your body. Insulin coming through your skin is absolutely the wrong way to do it. We're forced to do it that way, but it does. So if you have glucagon in the pump, it doesn't fix the high blood sugar problem of eating carbs and going up. Now, you could say it would prevent some lows, and the data looks like it will prevent some lows. I do think you have to do it a little carefully. We can get into the engineering behind that. But the other piece is there's an economic component to this. You have a different pump, you have a different infusion set, and you have another hormone that costs money. So we're going to need to make an economic argument that this adds benefit above and beyond the 5 closed-loop systems that are going to be on the market soon that are already reducing a lot. Like, my lows are down to 2 to 3% of the day. So if you're going to your payer, say you have Aetna, and say, I want this one, well, I'm going to go from 3% of the day to 2.5% of the day for lows. That's pretty, but it's going to cost $300 more a month. So there are some big challenges. JDRF hasn't given up on it. And then I guess the last challenge is chronic dosing of glucagon we have no data on. Is that good for your body? Right now, your body is still making glucagon. It's just not able to make it, it doesn't do it properly. So you're adding glucagon on top of glucagon. It's a long, complicated story. So if you see the Boston group, for example, that JDRF funded back in the beginning, they've switched primarily to insulin alone right now. And they do have a dual hormone pump, and they are talking about glucagon being in there, but it's actually a lot more complicated, and insulin alone works. It actually works really well. It's not perfect, but the biggest benefit on insulin alone will be on the high side. I don't think it's the low side is the biggest issue anymore, for what it's worth. Any other questions?
Getting back to the 670G availability through Medtronics, it's very fast. We were up for an upgrade in February, and we got a 670G 3 weeks later.
Really? So have you tried recently?
Medtronics is pumping those 670Gs out. They're up to demand as far as we did.
So I know it has improved some.
But you have to start on the model below that.
In the beginning you did. I think now there is no model below it anymore.
Okay, so even if you're not on Medtronic now.
No, so in the interim period before it launched, they were trying to get people onto the prequel version, the 630G, but now there is no, it's 670.
So I kind of missed when you did the thumbprint correction, and then you said your brother uses his Apple Watch. What were you using?
Yeah, so this is a do-it-yourself system called Loop. There are essentially 3 do-it-yourself systems out in the community right now, 2 in the US and 1 in the rest of the world. And essentially what they do is they take advantage of I hate to say this, it's a vulnerability in the Medtronic pump that my friend figured out and realized that you can remotely control the older Medtronic pumps. Now, once FDA realized this and the companies realized that, they cracked down on that big time. But these old pumps, 520 and 720 and 550 and 750 series, can be controlled remotely. So there are 2, one's called Loop, one's called OpenAPS in the US. They use an app-based controller to communicate, run an algorithm, and communicate to the pump. And it's based, so I pull out, I can look at my system, I can show it to you afterwards. I mean, it's really quite nice. And again, I empathize with Medtronic because they're FDA regulated. They can't iterate like these guys do. These guys are changing stuff constantly. And these guys are a loose network of smart people around the world, sitting in their computer rooms, coding. So,
There was a hackathon.
yeah, so I go to a lot of these. It's a great. I mean, these are not like. There's a guy up in Rochester who was one of the original people, John Kostick, who now works at Beta Bionics. He was behind the original Night Scout. Some of you probably know Night Scout. He worked at Wegmans. He was a computer, programmer at Wegmans. And in his side, he got in this community, and they started creating this software. So now the guy who built this is like an Apple software developer. And then there's another guy who builds the radios. He's some sort of communication software person, and hence the radio controllers. Then there are a bunch of algorithm people. Like on Loop, there are about 4 or 5 algorithms you can choose. But I will say the reason I think that JDRF is working with this community and FDA is the functionality is really amazing. So for example, tonight, I'll go have a beer and watch the hockey game. I can click on my app, go like this. 3 of the things that it gives me are, like if I want to go simple, fast-acting carb, medium-acting carb, pizza-acting carb. Or I can click emojis. Check this out. I click a beer. If I'm having an IPA, I would say 18 grams of carbs. Boom, I'm going. And that's all captured. It's really intuitive. There's the one in Europe is based on an Android platform and doesn't even require a communicator because they use a Korean pump that speaks Bluetooth. And that Korean company has allowed this to happen. It's called Soil. So again, right now, this is off-label, unauthorized by FDA. People are allowed to treat themselves however they want. FDA regulates things that are sold to people. So this community is in a kind of a gray zone because they're not really selling anything, but they are kind of marketing it, but FDA's left them alone. And we've talked to FDA a lot about this. Even this radio, which the guy sells for cost, he's like, hey, I don't know what you do with it. I'm selling you a radio. I'm not selling you a closed loop system. So, and his daughter has type 1. So the open protocol, open source community, the do-it-yourself community, they do these hackathons. You know, there's a $40,000 bounty on the Omnipod hack. Apparently it's been hacked. Apparently even the 670G has been hacked. You know, so there are layers of security now. You know, just like any computer thing, there are smart people out there who figure out how workarounds. So when we talk to FDA, one of the ways that we're able to get traction on this is you can't stop this community. So if you can't stop them, we can't have people using crappy old pumps. It's better for FDA to figure out a pathway that allows you to understand the risk. Hey, I'm using an algorithm that some person in their garage created, but I'm willing to do that. I know that person, he's a friend. Or I don't know it, but I know 1,000 people are doing it with great success. JDRF is also about to fund a study with Helmsley where we're going to track all of these people, or as many as we can, to show the safety profile. So the do-it-yourself stuff is very interesting. It's been a hot button topic because people have. I was at a conference in Europe, and a doctor from Sweden was yelling at another doctor saying, you should be arrested for prescribing that to kids. So it is like controversial because they're like, you're breaking European law. I am more of a libertarian. I'm like, hey, keep away from me. I'm doing it myself. Let me alone. So that's the tension in the United States. We don't have a very libertarian country. People sue each other. So we need a pathway where the companies will open up their pumps, and that's what the initiative's focused on.
So, being a pharmacist myself, we looked at pharmacogenetic therapy for things like anticoagulation in order to provide the best care for our patients because not every patient reacts to the drug the same way. Has JDRF looked at that for insulin therapy? So if somebody's using insulin Lispo, it might not have as good of an effect on it rather than something else.
Not as much for insulin therapy, but as I think probably everybody knows, this whole idea of personalized medicine is going crazy. So NIH just launched a very large initiative, for example, to do full genotyping of 1 million people in the United States. And we're going to put in a bunch of type 1 people in that population. JDRF has done a huge amount of a whole genome sequencing of type 1 diabetes. We're not to the level where I think you could say insulin, Humalog or Novolog or Apidra is better for one person than the other. We are looking at risk of complications progression, genetic risk for type 1 diabetes itself, so we can start to screen people and say you have a much higher risk than the person next to you. But that's definitely the future. The data in genomics, at this conference I went to the Vatican, they had some of the best scientists in the world show up. And one of the guys was talking about just progress in science. And when I was in grad school, the genome hadn't even been sequenced yet. And they talked about how long it takes and how much money to sequence. We're now getting to the point where you're going to be, in the next few years, able to sequence very cheaply each and every individual and start to then identify what are the right drugs for you. You know, one of the things that I often talk about is the overlap between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And I am a big proponent of CGM, this is not genetics, but it's the same idea, in type 2 diabetes. Because type 2 people, type 2, in the type 1 community, people sneer at type 2 people. Some people do. My kid didn't cause his diabetes. It can't be exercised away. Type 2 people didn't cause their disease. Type 2 is more genetic than type 1. When somebody is cured of type 2, they're cured of the symptoms. They still have the disease. But what's interesting is type 2 people are actually treated very slowly, meaning they come in and they get an A1C or a blood sugar reading and it says it's elevated. My dad's in this category right now. His fasting blood sugar is up to 120. So they're like, you need to lose 10 pounds. So he's out there, he's walking all the time, he's eating better. But then he goes back, and he could be anybody. Now your A1C is at 6.6. You need to go on metformin. Come back a year later, your A1C is 7.5. You need to go on insulin. What we know from the JDRF work is you could go into that person, put a CGM on them, and look at the patterns and very quickly identify what the problem is in that person and what the right drug is for them. So it's not a genetic way, it's actually a data-driven way to optimize the right therapy to somebody sooner. So we have the reason that Google is in diabetes is exactly this. I think it's actually one of the most embarrassing things. I know we have somebody from Novo here, but I have been hammering the insulin companies that if they were smarter, they should have had everybody on CGM much earlier, because people are not being treated properly and they're getting complications, particularly type 2 people, because the therapy doesn't get to them sooner. So whether it's genomics, data, you name it, we have a massive amount of work going on to try to optimize and personalize therapy. It's just not that, insulin, we're just not there completely yet.
Is your A1C improved since you've done the closed loop?
Yeah, so I was in the high 6 range. I'm now in the low 6 range, but the beauty is it's way beyond that. It's just so much easier. When I said that balance, like CGM, we've done a lot of studies. I've been on a CGM for 12 years now, which is unbelievable to me. But in any case,
Do you find it to be accurate? I don't know.
oh yeah, I do one test a day. One test a day. You'll see with the G6, the G6 doesn't even require finger sticks. Not to digress into a debate, but people become obsessed with the finger stick is always right. There's now a lot of data that the finger stick is becoming less accurate than the CGM. And so you're always taking that finger stick reading as gold. It's not always gold. And you have to appreciate there's a range of errors depending on the meter that you use. And actually, there's very, very solid evidence that I want to say about 75% of meters are less accurate than the CGM you're calibrating. I can get you the paper. So accuracy in CGM, yes, there's some times where they're off, but the bulk of the times they're absolutely accurate enough. My closed loop system and all of the data that we have on closed loop systems now is that using even inaccurate sensors, you get far superior readings to doing open loop. So, and the sensors are just going to get more and more accurate. I don't know if I didn't talk about the Abbott Libre. That's another finger stick free. It's kind of a quasi CGM because you don't get all the time readings. But just remember that the finger stick is not perfectly accurate as well. There's a lot to be said for that being impregnated under your skin versus there's so much data now that most of the accuracy of the finger stick meters are lab-based accuracy tests. If you take any kid who's eating lunch at school and really studied them carefully, the bulk of their finger sticks are going to be pretty inaccurate. Because I don't know how many people are wiping with alcohol or washing their hands before testing. Most people aren't, let's be honest. We've learned simply by wiping with your finger the first drop of blood and squeezing out a second drop, you can improve your finger stick meter by like 10, we call them MARD points. So the finger stick meters, this discrepancy when you're really mathematically inclined, people struggle with. But these sensors are actually really pretty accurate for the most part. Excellent. Well, I know people, it's getting late. I'm here, so I'm happy to stay after and answer any questions that folks have. Thanks. Any additional questions? That's not
So,
my
Aaron,
mic.
that was amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to Central New York and share with us some of the top advancements and all the progress that's been made. And it's so promising, and I find it truly inspiring and motivating to me, both personally because of my daughter Maddie, and professionally, given my role with JDRF. So I guess I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for taking the time to come here. And I was really thrilled that you were able to meet Aaron and learn more about all the progress that's been made. There's no one better to hear it from, quite honestly, than Aaron. And it would not be possible without you and your support. And we are just in a really exciting time. It's an exciting time for research, and it's an exciting time for our Central New York chapter, which is doing really, really well because of your involvement. So I guess I wanted to ask, not only thank you for your support, but to also ask for your help, because there are so many different ways to get involved. Aaron talked about the importance of advocacy as an example. It's so important given the amount of funding that comes from the federal government and other areas. It could be through outreach. It could be involvement in one of our upcoming events, like golf here at Turning Stone, or through a donation. And another important thing is to think about people that you know who are not involved with us right now and should be in any of those ways. And if you can think of someone, if you would reach out to me and just let me know, because I would be happy to get them involved. So again, thank you. Thank you for coming tonight, and we're just so pleased to share this information with you.